Good evening, and let me welcome you to another presentation of the Charles Hamilton Houston lecture series. I'm Charles Ogletree, the founder and the director, and so delighted to have so many of you here tonight for this special fall program. As with all of the programs sponsored by the Institute, they are free and open to the public, and our programs are also webcast. This is a very special evening for us, coming after the opening of the Institute in honor of one of Harvard's most distinguished graduates, Charles Hamilton Houston. It opened September 15th. And this is a continuation in our series on issues of race and justice. And no trial in the last century has generated as much national and international coverage as has the trial of Michael Jackson this past year. And we are very pleased to have people here to talk about that as well as other important issues. Those of you who are not on our list for our updates, we do circulate a sign-up sheet, and if you have an email address, make sure you include it. After you hear from the speakers, there will be a brief Q&A session by me, and then you're welcome to come to the microphones in the middle of the room to ask a question. This is an audience largely of law students and lawyers, and I know that law students and lawyers have difficulty asking questions rather than making statements, but today I hope you'll think very seriously before you go to the microphone and remember that there's a question at the end of your profound thought that you'd want to give us today. We have three distinguished speakers with us today. One is en route. Our special guest speaker is Tom Mesereau, who is no stranger to this community. Mr. Mesereau is actually a graduate of Harvard College before he went to Hastings Law School in California. And he has been a distinguished member of the California Bar and has not only handled significant cases, I'll talk about Michael Jackson in a moment, but he also was counsel for Robert Blake and was the lawyer able to get Mr. Blake out on bail before they both had a parting of the ways. He also was quite helpful in making sure that Robert Blake was not charged with the death penalty, which was certainly a possibility in the state of California. Most people know him from his flamboyant and incredibly effective work in the Michael Jackson case, which generated international attention. Much of it was on the defendant, Michael Jackson, but as people began to hone in on the evidence, it really focused on the lawyer, the amount of preparation, the effort to keep the cameras out of the courtroom because of the fear that it might prevent his client from getting a fair trial, challenging the government's seizure of thousands of pieces of evidence from Mr. Jackson's home before the trial, the vigorous examination of every witness called by the prosecution during the case, the willingness to stand up to the judge in some very heated arguments to ensure that his client was effectively represented, and the very much amazing verdict of 14 acquittals on every charge that Mr. Jackson faced in this particular trial. That's the public Tom Mesereau that you may know. The private Tom Mesereau, in my view, is even more significant advocate of justice. Every year he goes down south of places like Mississippi and works on death penalty cases. He has been volunteering time in Southern California, working in the community there continuously. He has been recognized and acknowledged by the former Reverend Cecil Murray of First AME Church in California, by Bishop Blakey of the West Angeles Church, where Johnny Cochran was funeralized in April of this year, and many others. So he is someone who's well known in the community, not for what you read about in the press, but for what he does every single day for poor, deprived, voiceless, and often powerless people in the criminal justice system. And we're very pleased that despite his very crazy schedule, he has flown here from California, walked to his old living quarters, Elliott House, and the Yard, been on the Harvard Law School campus, walked through the Harvard Square, and finds himself a Cantabrigian for the moment. You'll be hearing more from him in a short while, but please join me in welcoming Tom Mesereau. In addition to things I've already said about Tom Mesereau, who's going to talk a little bit about his role in the Michael Jackson case and the role of lawyers. What is interesting is that we're going to move through this program rather quickly because one of the sort of unsung heroes that he is that tonight, and you'll have time to watch it, Barbara Walters has selected the 10 most fascinating people in America, and one of those people that she selected is Tom Mesereau, who will be on the interview tonight. I think it's Channel 5 here at 10 p.m. So you'll be able to see another side of Tom Mesereau. And Channel 7 is covering it. Somewhere Dan Housley's floating around the room, so you'll see there's Dan, a story as well on Channel 7 about our distinguished visitor. So I'm just very pleased to have someone who was involved in a very important case, and a very tough case. The Simpson case was the case of the 20th century in terms of publicity, and the Jackson case clearly was the case of the 21st century, with more international coverage and more actual coverage than any other case in the history of cases that have been covered thus far. And what we saw throughout was a very much under control, measured, confident, and one of the few lawyers who said over and over, not that his client is not guilty, my client is innocent. A very important and bold statement that he made over and over again. We're so pleased to have him here at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice Lecture Series. Please join, as he comes to the podium, Tom Mesereau.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored and privileged to be invited to speak to the law school. I want to thank Professor Ogletree and the Institute and the law school and everyone associated with it. I'm really, really touched to be here and I've been really looking forward to it. The Institute, as I understand it, deals with issues of race and justice. So I'd like to begin by talking about how those two factors played into the Michael Jackson case and what they mean for defense lawyers in general. There are two things I think a defense lawyer has to do when it comes to race in a criminal case. Number one, what is the significance of race, if any, in a case? And number two, what do you do with it? And there are situations where you might decide there clearly is an issue of racial injustice, racism, bigotry, favoritism, whatever it is, based on skin color or ethnicity, or it could be religion, whatever it is. And if you identify that problem as a real problem in the case, the next question is to properly defend your client and secure your client's freedom. What do you do with it? Do you raise it at all? Do you raise it before trial? Do you raise it during the trial? What do you do with it, practically speaking, to save your client? Because saving your client is the number one responsibility you have, in my opinion. Now, if you look at American history, particularly the history of our justice system and how race plays a role in it, there have been cases where the defense lawyer, in conjunction with the client, decided that the case was a primarily political case, where the number one goal was to raise and expose racism, to raise and expose bigotry. And if that's something the lawyer and the client decided to do, that's something that might be the primary objective. But what I'm talking about is where the primary objective is your client's freedom, your client's reputation, and saving your client's life. And I'm going to briefly mention three cases where there was a potential racial component and how I handled it differently in each. In the early 90s, I agreed to defend a case pro bono in federal court in Los Angeles. It was United States of America versus Patricia Moore. Patricia Moore was an African-American woman from Compton, California, who was on the Compton City Council. And she had become quite controversial in Los Angeles for being very, very vocal about her views on race, particularly racism directed at blacks by whites. And in the aftermath of the Rodney King problems in Los Angeles, which I think many of you know about, there was another incident in South Los Angeles where an African-American girl went to a liquor store and got into an argument with a Korean-American owner, and she was shot to death, shot in the back of the head. Her name was Latasha Harlins. The owner of the store was prosecuted. She had an African-American lawyer, a prominent one, defending her. She was convicted and got probation, and the black community in LA was absolutely outraged at the lenient sentence. and felt that had the victim not been African American, the sentence would have been far harsher. And Patricia Moore was very vocal about her feelings about that. Unfortunately, she became a target of an FBI investigation into corruption in the city of Compton. And the FBI set up a very complex and intricate sting operation, and they had a developer who was posing as someone who could bring tremendous economic benefits to this community. It was all a fake. It was all a fabrication, and he was approaching various members of the city council and other prominent members in Compton about developing a waste-to-energy plant which would bring Compton jobs, a larger tax base, revenues, all sorts of other advantages. They talked about setting up a daycare center. They talked about job training for students. They talked about helping the elderly with opportunities at the plant. It was going to be something that would take this very poor community economically and put it on the map. It was all a fake. It was just a sting operation. And they were taping people for 3 to 4 years in the community, everyone from ministers to politicians to business people. And unfortunately, Ms. Moore at one point was taped for a year taking money she should not have been taking. Now, to most people in my profession, to most people in the public, this was a case no lawyer would ever want, and why would you ever take the case free? And there was a lot more to the case than those tapes which appeared to incriminate her suggested. They had worked for a year to try and get Patricia Moore to incriminate herself. They had taken a fellow from Las Vegas, an African-American male who was trying to gain favors with the government, who had a conviction, and they arranged for him to essentially become her boyfriend. And he approached her at her office with flowers, and he told her that he was president of a business development company that could
To my friends and fans, thank you very much for all of your support. Together, we will see this through to the very end.
Girl, close your eyes, let that rhythm get in.